Hey everyone, today on Lever Time we're going to do something a little different. Last week, David Sirota and I met up at On Air Fest, which was a podcasting festival in New York City. While we were there, David was invited onto the stage to moderate and host a panel that was all about climate change. But this wasn't your typical climate conversation. Normally, these panels talk about the impending dangers of a warming planet, and at some point it'll come up that there's a general scientific consensus around humans being the key factor in climate change. And critically, we are the ones influencing how wide-reaching the impacts of climate change are. These are important discussions, ones which we shouldn't be tuning out. But at the same time, it feels like the issue constantly lives in the background. Yes, the climate is covered and it's discussed, but sometimes in an obligatory way. But in the last 6 months, we've seen devastating hurricanes in Florida and North Carolina, and then there were the fires in Los Angeles. Extreme weather is real, and it's here. Perhaps most importantly, climate change is happening whether we want to take it seriously or not. But that's why I found this panel interesting. In this panel, not only will David and his guests discuss the science and stories around extreme weather, but they'll also unpack the fight for attention in a media environment that changes topics at the drop of a dime. So I hope you all enjoy the panel as much as I did. And let's start the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. And I want to thank the sponsors of this panel, first and foremost, Impact US and Covering Climate Now. If there are any creators here that want to learn more about their work, they have a booth out in the creator space. This is a great panel of amazing people who cover climate. And what we're going to discuss today is not just the significance of covering climate and making sure that climate is part of storytelling and journalism, but how climate is really a part of every story that I think is unfolding in our world, and how to make it part of the stories that we're all covering. So I'll just introduce our panel here before we get to everything. I'm going to go in no particular order. There's Kate Aronoff, who's a staff writer at The New Republic. She's the author of Overheated: How Capitalism Broke the Planet and How We Fight Back, and co-author of A Planet to Win: Why We Need a Green New Deal. She's also a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute and serves on Dissent's editorial board. There is Kendra Pierre-Louis, an award-winning climate reporter. Her work looks at how our climate is changing and the impact of those changes on everyday people. She most recently worked at Bloomberg and previously was a reporter and producer on the Gimlet Media podcast, How to Save a Planet. And there's Lauren Casey, as a meteorologist for the Climate Matters program at Climate Central. Lauren specializes in communicating the connections between climate change and extreme weather. In her role, she supports Climate Central's network of meteorologists and journalists to provide tools and resources that best enable them, on the front lines in so many communities, to tell the climate stories impacting their audiences. And there's Magdala Mescal, a journalist, mediator, artist, land tender, and therapeutic guide in learning. They work as an engagement director of Journalism Collaboration, the Journalism Collaboration Project covering climate now. So these are amazing people who cover climate and tell stories of climate. And to my mind as a journalist, I am constantly frustrated by the fact that climate stories are not being told, and I'm guessing a lot of folks on this panel share that frustration. So I want to start by going around this panel and asking for some examples of stories and reporting that they've done that profiled what's going on in our climate and told stories of what's going on in our climate that surprised them, or they came upon things that were unexpected, or covered those things in a new kind of way. So why don't we go left to right here? Like, have you talk about a story or two that you've done where you went in perhaps thinking one thing and coming out thinking another thing, or found a new way into the issue?
Thanks for having me, everybody. So I was a broadcast meteorologist for many years, but with my role in Climate Central the last several years, I work with broadcast meteorologists and journalists to help supply, pitch story ideas. We provide resources. We also conduct our own research. So one story that I particularly found fascinating and really drove home the point that climate change is all around us and affects our everyday lives. I was working with the chief meteorologist out of Albany, New York, a gentleman named Steve LaPointe, and it was 2023 when we were having all that bad wildfire smoke coming in from the western wildfires in Western Canada. And so he did a piece. We have a tool at Climate Central. It's an attribution science tool. So it helps us. We use model data to kind of integrate and show the impact of climate change on daily temperatures. So the likelihood that climate change has increased or the likelihood that it's decreased those temperatures on a given day. So it's called the Climate Shift Index. So stick with me. So they were having particularly hazy skies because of the wildfire smoke coming in from thousands of miles away. So local news, they have the sky cam, and he's like, oh, we have terrible hazy skies. It's impacting our air quality at the surface, and takes that connection and drives it back to the western wildfires in Western Canada, thousands of miles away from Albany, New York, and then shows the Climate Shift Index, which is showing that those temperatures in Western Canada were made at least 5 times more likely by climate change. And we know that heat and dry weather in particular helps to fuel these fires. So making that connection of people just looking up in the sky and going, wow, the sky looks really weird and hazy, back to climate change, I thought was really just a really interesting and fascinating connection.
Kendra, before you go, I want to see if we can play these clips. I don't know who I'm looking towards, but we should be able to play some audio clips.
Char Miller's point earlier, the perspective of the federal government and local governments was simply to let people keep building.
Sorry, that's the wrong clip. The second clip. My bad. Kendra's clip.
Oh.
It's fun to move, powered by you, and not through fossil fuels. Ride down some stairs, park anywhere. That's the beauty of biking. Fun, clean, healthy. That's the beauty of cycling. Accessible physical mountains and roads. That's the beauty of biking. It's fun, clean, healthy. That's the beauty of cycling. Accessible physical mountains and roads. That's the beauty of biking. It's fun to move, powered by you, and not through fossil fuels. Ride down some stairs, park anywhere. That's the beauty of biking.
Okay, so that's a good preface for the question I just asked.
Yeah, so for 2.5 years, I worked for a podcast called How to Save a Planet, and our focus was on climate solutions. And we weren't looking for individual solutions. We weren't there to tell you to recycle your cans or whatever. We were looking at systemic solutions. And one of the things that came up is how many of you guys have heard that you should bike to work, that biking instead of driving, right? But when we have that conversation, it's often positioned like biking is this sacrifice, right? You want to take the car, but you should take the bike. And the thing is I grew up in New York, and I didn't learn how to drive until I moved to rural Vermont for a year. And driving has always been low-key traumatic for me. But I loved riding my bike. I actually got hypothermia and then decided to learn how to drive. And so I was we were talking about story ideas, and I realized that when I was in my late teens, I desperately wanted an Isuzu Amigo. And the Isuzu Amigo commercial was based off of the Slinky song, which is based off that jingle that we just played. And it made no sense. I lived in New York City and I did not know how to drive. Why did I want an Isuzu Amigo so badly? And it was the ad. I love the ad. And so we ended up doing a whole episode that sort of started with my love of the Isuzu Amigo and talked about how whenever you look at popular culture, we really reinforce this norm that the car is great. The car is the thing that you want. You look at Clueless, you look at so many movies, the car is freedom, it's liberty, it's all of these things. And when you look at how bicycles turn up in popular culture, it's the 40-year-old virgin. It's losers unless you're a kid.
Pee Wee Herman.
Yes, it's Pee Wee Herman. And so I kind of took us through, in the episode, I took us through the history of like the early days of the bicycle. The bicycle only dates back to like the 1800s. And when people first got their hands on the bicycle, they were crazy. They would say things like it was better than flying, even though they'd never flown before, because they hadn't invented the airplane yet. And talked all about that. And then I went to an adult learn to bike ride class, and I recorded the adults learning to ride a bike, and they sounded like children. It was so great. And then so the whole episode was really about the beauty of biking. And to cap it off, I got our engineer, Peter Leonard, to make a jingle about the beauty. You can find it on Spotify. And like 6 months after the episode aired, I learned from someone in Albany that it was the hold music for their bike shop. And so one of the things that this is weird coming from a journalist, but there is a little bit of propaganda when you're thinking about climate change, which is that it's so often framed as a sacrifice. Like you should change your lifestyle in X, Y, and Z as a sacrifice, but we don't think about the ways in which a fossil fuel economy is costing us, right? In a very personal way. Biking 99% of the time, especially if you're talking small distances, especially if you're talking with decent infrastructure, is more fun than driving. It is. And you don't have to worry about what you're gonna do with your bike at the end of the trip. Like, it's just easier, especially like with City Bike, it's gotten even better. And so that was kind of the nugget of the episode, is like we talked about the climate benefits of biking and everything, but that wasn't the point. The point was a little bit of propaganda that like, actually this thing that is good for the planet is good for you and it's fun.
Kate Aronoff, if we can put Kate's book image on the there we go. There's Kate Aronoff's book. Kate, something that surprised you, was unexpected?
Yeah, I'll just say a little bit about the mechanics of my job, which is the context for this, which is that I am a staff writer at the New Republic, which means that 2 or 3 times a week I have to find something new to write. And I don't know if all of you have original thoughts 2 or 3 times a week. I do not. So that often means I have to, look pretty hard for things that are climate related. And most things are. I think that, that is the title of this panel, obviously. But finding sort of a way in, and have been doing, this beat for a long time. And so have found ways to, find sort of the climate side of different things, which partially because there are just not that many climate reporters, it's a pretty small sort of set of us, that you can often find something that people aren't writing about, particularly if the subject is not one that is sort of intuitively about climate. So one, for instance, is about the border, right? And you sort of look at border politics and think, this is the thing that is in the news, obviously more so than even the climate crisis itself, and doesn't typically get talked about as a climate issue, when in fact it is, one of the sort of biggest climate issues, because it is making our world more dangerous and keeping people who are fleeing, in many cases, situations that are either exacerbated or caused by rising temperatures, by droughts, by hurricanes. That is the sort of way that literally our borders are being policed to keep out climate refugees. Whether or not those terms are used, whether or not that is a language that is talked about, that is sort of the story, is that this is a major, major part of why people want to come to this country and leave their homes that they wouldn't want to leave otherwise. And so that's, I think the more serious end of it. There is also sort of more superfluous stuff that I get to write about sometimes, like last summer during the Eras Tour, there's a lot of coverage of Taylor Swift's private jets and their emissions. And so her press team put out a statement about how she had bought a lot of carbon offsets, which are nonsense, which are completely sort of made up, and really sort of, I don't want to get into too big of a tangent on that, but are total bunk. Anyway, so this piece was just about, why did she say this? What does that mean? Because you hear that kind of thing, and that sounds, I think, to people who don't spend most of their days thinking about climate change in very sort of like zoomed in ways, that sounds kind of reasonable. Okay, she flew and she bought these carbon offsets. That's all good. And, it's kind of complicated. It's kind of complicated to understand both what they are and why they are nonsense. And so, having sort of like events like that can be an entry into into finding, ways to talk about it. And I don't know, I mean, it's interesting having to write so much. You sort of throw a lot of things at the wall and see what sticks, and I'm always a little bit surprised as to what ends up catching people's attention. Plenty of things that I think are interesting, most people don't. And often the things that I, think this is a total throwaway, okay, I have something to file by 5 p.m., end up, getting a lot of attention in very unexpected ways. So I don't know if I have a math for like what draws people into climate coverage. I've not figured that out in 10 years, but it is often surprising, the things that people kind of grasp onto.
Magdala, can we put the Covering Climate Now image up here? What about you?
I'm the engagement director at Covering Climate Now, which is a journalism collaboration. And it's great to chat right after you saying all of that, because I think what we do really is try to make connections to all beats, all journalists around how the climate is connected to the subject matter that they're covering. Our idea is that really this is something that we all deal with. We all live on the earth and we all need to factor in. I kind of like to think about it as like the reciprocity beat. Like, what are we taking from the earth, and therefore what are we giving back? And so as human beings, it is a part of our lives inherently. And so we do trainings, we make connections between journalists and sources. A lot of, also, as Kate said, there aren't that many journalists who are dedicated to climate. And so if they are, then they sometimes feel alone in the newsrooms that they work in, or feel alone just on the teams that they're interacting with. So it's just nice to have a bunch of other people who they can talk to and get advice from. And I think overall, I like to consider kind of reframe climate coverage from this crisis, doom and gloom led coverage, to considering how communities are responding to the circumstances that they're dealing with. And that for me is really empowering. I live in Grass Valley, California, which is a wildfire stricken area, but it's also actually like a fire loving landscape. So even that reshift to, oh shoot, so many wildfires, to, well, actually this landscape really loves fire. And how has fire been used historically here, and why is it now being exacerbated into wildfires, shifts the way that I orient to the crisis, shifts the way my heart feels in the place that I live. And I think some of my work in mediation and conflict work also helps, because I think, yes, it's a human-made cause and made crisis, but guilt and shame aren't great emotions to shift into action. And so how can we share the climate story with people that enable choice and agency versus inhibit movement through guilt and shame? So those are some of the bigger frames that we're dealing with, yeah.
And I'll address my own question. Some of the most unexpected things that I find in our reporting has to do with the decisions that we've made in the past. I'm pretty interested in how we got here in all sorts of stories that I cover, but in particular climate, because I think climate feels like this thing that just happened, not necessarily inevitably, but we don't have a really good idea of all the decision points. So now I want to play, if we can, that first clip to give you a sense of what we do at The Lever to try to add a historical perspective.
And to Char Miller's point earlier, the perspective of the federal government and local governments was simply to let people keep building.
This is about California.
In what was likely a well-intentioned policy, the Eisenhower administration in the 1950s subsidized continuous construction in flammable areas by offering tax relief and low-interest loans to rebuild. One thing you need to know, though, is that California was settled in a blaze of violence and fire. When European settlers first arrived, they saw how indigenous Californians made ample use of controlled burning, in some cases burning up to 10% of the state's landmass annually. For the settlers, this posed a problem. The fires made the terrain inhospitable to commerce and industry, so their response was murder. In waves of brutal attacks, settlers killed the indigenous Californians. Then, they sought to tame the land. Whereas the indigenous Californians made ample use of fire, the settlers thought they could suppress and control it. And in the name of industry, they created the bedrocks of a political economy dedicated to pushing the boundaries of how far humans could manipulate the environment around them.
So the idea there, I think, what was unexpected for me, which is kind of somewhat embarrassing and that I live out in the American West, was that I didn't have a full grasp of how the suppression of fire in a climate intensified world, how the suppression of fire can create more fire. I didn't fully, and it's kind of in some ways counterintuitive until you think about it for a second, and I hadn't really thought about it for a second. And what we try to do is try to put those points and those revelations into our reporting, in particular about climate change, to try to get people to have those aha moments. I mean, I think that's like one of the things that people enjoy most, I think, in any media, are those moments where you're like, oh, I didn't get that before. Aha, now I completely get it. So I want to ask everybody another question, and we're going to try to open this up to Q&A towards the end. It's a question that I've thought about a lot especially since doing the movie that I worked on, Don't Look Up, which is, if climate change is a threat multiplier and impacts everything we do, why do you think climate conversations, climate content, even where climate is in the background of a story or a movie or journalism, why does climate still seem so isolated and siloed from other topics? So we'll go the other way. Magdala, you start.
Well, my initial answer is that I think it's shared as a really divisive issue politically. And that's strategic, because when you divide, I think you can slow down progress. When there's a perception that there isn't a consensus on something. But that's false. 89, actually, at Covering Climate Now, we're working on a project based on a study that 89% of the population of the world wants climate action. So there's a large consensus of people who know that this is an issue and who want to do something about it. So that's my first gut response. I wonder, curious what y'all think.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think the extent to which climate politics have become this sort of like object of ridicule can't be overstated, and that is this sort of long-running ideological project. You know, this isn't the biggest example of this, but like Al Gore on South Park, right? It's like this is a silly thing to care about. This is, you know, a cause that only sort of bleeding heart liberals are interested in. And I think that is with us in some ways. It's changed a lot, obviously, but I think the sort of idea that climate is this really sort of kooky thing for tree huggers is still just a part of the way it's thought about, including by people who, you know, wouldn't say they're climate deniers or wouldn't, you know, would say they're sort of supportive of doing something about rising temperatures, but still just don't think of it, even if they, you know, are progressive on a number of other fronts. And I do think that's changing to some extent, but yeah, I mean, I think it has been hard to communicate that climate change is just a thing that affects everything else around us. So if you look at people who their insurance is going up by double because they live in Florida or California or somewhere else, that is a direct result of climate. And there's a lot of other stuff bound up with it, but getting sort of the point across that these sort of basic cost of living issues, these things that are, you know, really talked about in a more mainstream way than a lot of climate coverage is able to be. Getting the point that this is all sort of a part of our, you know, the fact that the world is changing in ways that we do not recognize, has been really difficult to communicate, in part because there has been such an effort to sort of slough off climate from the rest of the sort of conversation about any other venue of politics.
I think I'm going to come at it from a slightly different point of view, which is I think part of why climate ended up siloed is because we silo science. And so much of early climate reporting was kind of really narrowing, coming in from the science perspective. And so if you're like a lot of creative people, a lot of storytellers don't necessarily feel comfortable with science, like I'm using science in air quotes, but like the idea of science and the technical parts of science. I interviewed Roland Emmerich, who did Day After Tomorrow. And if you watch that movie, there are two things that really, you should watch it as a Independence Day and Day After Tomorrow double feature. And if you watch them back to back, one of the things that becomes apparent pretty quickly is Day After Tomorrow is Independence Day, but make it climate. And when I was talking to him, I was like really nervous because you don't want to accuse someone of being derivative. And he was like, no, we did that on purpose because he was coming off of the success of Independence Day. And he knew that if you said, it's like Independence Day, but make it climate, that it would be easier to get it greenlit. And the source material for that is this wackadoo book that's like not very good scientifically speaking, but it's great from a storytelling perspective. So that was how we got around kind of the difficulty of the science bit. And I think that's the issue for a lot of people who are creative, is that they don't necessarily have good source material. I think that's changing. Like sci-fi is now a thing. There's more climate storytelling. One of my favorite TV series on Netflix recently was Partner Track, and there's a whole climate like subplot in that. It's a rom-com. It's a frothy legal rom-com. But I think early on, the biggest difficulty was a lot of people who are creative are naturally tuned off to science, and climate was coming in from that science track.
After the break, we'll hear the rest of David's panel from On Air Fest. We'll be right back.
Can we put the Climate Central website up here? And this is a good question. The idea of climate as a separate story from other stories. In some ways, meteorology, how can climate be separate from the weather report, and what do you, I guess, what's your feedback on how to make climate part of the way Americans understand their day-to-day weather?
Yeah, that's a great question. Obviously, they're inextricably linked, so it's important to have that conversation. But I think some of it is, fear-based. They don't, people don't want to go out there and talk about climate because it has become politicized. And I think there is this perception that there are so many deniers out there. However, Yale Program for Climate Change Communication conducts surveys every couple of years, and a category of people dismissive. So these are the people that climate change is a hoax type of people, around 10% of the country. That's it. So it's really just they have the loudest voices, but it's not the majority of people. And as of 2023, it was 10%, and as of 2013, also the dismissive people were about 10% of the population. So it has been and continues to be a small segment of the population. A lot of people do want to hear about this, and the amount of negative feedback, I started talking about climate and my role as a meteorologist probably around 2012, and you would get some negative, feedback from viewers, but in more recent days, you get actually more positive responses from people saying, thank you for teaching me. I wanted to learn about this. I want to know more. And I think a way to talk about climate is talk about climate solutions. I mean, communication itself is a climate solution, and to kind of veer away from the doomism, climate change is, as you said, a threat multiplier, but climate solutions is also a benefit multiplier. Climate solutions are quality of life improvements. You think about urban heat island and planting urban trees. That has so many cascading benefits for the local community, from reducing urban heat island effects, reducing the temperatures, surface and air temperatures, reducing energy use. There's a body of research growing that shows, improves mental health, physical health, reduces crime, stormwater runoff helps reduce that. So there's so many benefits to climate solutions, and I think if you can talk more about that, I mean, who doesn't want a greener, healthier, neighborhood? I think that's a good way to kind of tackle it.
I mean, I think a lot about this when I watch television, feature films, scripted television. That when you're watching these shows, I find they're mostly happening in a climate that doesn't exist. right? Like you watch these shows and it's like there's rain and there's snow and there's a sunny day, and the climate crisis just doesn't really exist at all. And I think about the movie Parasite, which I guess you could argue it either way. Is it a climate movie? Is it not a climate movie? I don't think most people who watch it who aren't told, hey, this might be a climate movie, think of it as a climate movie, even though the climate is like right there in the background, sometimes in the foreground. And I think about that movie a lot because it masterfully, I think, at least showed an ecological setting that is clearly impacted by climate without trying to grab you and say, hey, this is the scene about climate change. It's at least, though, a relatively realistic portrayal of climate as people deal with it day to day. And I think a lot about that because I think, to my mind, that's part of the way to meet people where they are, meet the audience where it might be, where there's this thing that is the climate crisis that's happening, and then there's lives lived inside of that climate crisis, and something doesn't have to be, quote, climate content in order for the climate crisis to be there. And I think the lack of it being there in journalism and in the entertainment world makes it easier to take the issue and say this is just some weird cause of weird people and not a real thing, because it's never really represented on your screen in any other way other than a climate story or a climate movie. And I think that's a segue to one more question I want to ask before we open it up to some questions from the audience, which is just real quick, what you think about when you think about the challenge of lots of people who even acknowledge climate change may not want to think about it, may not want to listen to or consume media content about it simply because it makes them sad. Like I think about that a lot, and I don't know what the right answer is, but there's an amazing group of people up here who probably have some thoughts on it. Like how do we bust through that?
I used to have a rule in my first job in journalism at Popular Science where if nobody died in a story, I could make it funny. And I think that's true in general. Like, climate is deeply serious, but it's also really absurd. And one of the things that I really loved about How to Save a Planet is we were really, I don't know if we were really funny, but we were at least trying to be humorous and engaging with each other. And I think humor is a big way into it. Like, reality is funny. We're currently living in kind of the most absurd timeline ever. If you tried to script it, it would seem fake. And you can use that. Like, you can't, like, I think make it funny.
Any other thoughts about how to break through the doom?
Yeah, I mean, I don't consume content about climate change that is not for work. And that is partially because it's what I do for work, and if I have free time, I don't engage with it as much. Obviously, you can't escape it, et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of it is just really cringe. I mean, it's like things that are branded climate are just hard to listen to. It's often not funny. It's like any political art is really hard in general. I think it's really hard for political art not to be bad. And I think climate, in part, obviously this is very close for me, but because I spend all day working on it. But I think it's really hard not to have it be bad. And so getting people who are genuinely funny to talk about it is important. And and I think that, to what you were saying earlier, I think there is this barrier to people who spend their lives perfecting the art of comedy, how to make people laugh or how to entertain people in other ways, and have not spent a lot of time thinking about the science. And I think there is this sort of barrier to being able to engage on that level. It's not hard. It's not, I think it's not hard for people to figure that. But I think having the sort of people with genuine talent do things that are literate in the kind of things that we're talking about, in not even climate science, just the sort of basic dynamics of climate politics, could go a long way, rather than trying to reverse engineer and have people, I'm not funny. Like, having people like me try to make interesting content about, a comedy podcast or something like that. I think you have to I don't know how to do it. I don't have like a real answer, but I think having people who have a skill set become literate on climate is maybe the way.
Yeah. I just wanted to quickly add, if any of you are on YouTube, like I think Raleigh Williams, he does a show called Climate Town. He does a decent job of kind of trying to thread the needle between humor and like actually good climate science. He does like an episode a month because he actually has decent production values.
Any other thoughts?
I think it was about just how everyday people are interacting with the climate. Like that's, to me, it can be both like absurd and also so menial and routine that there isn't so much doom and gloom, if that makes sense. Like I'm thinking about when the LA fires struck. I live in Northern California, and we haven't had a fire that has hit a city like LA, but we've had many, many fires where I live, and that have been much larger in like their acreage than the LA fire. But of course, the symbolism and the destruction of the LA fires were the largest that we've seen. And I had family call me from Ethiopia, where my family is from, and their first question was like, why is everyone building with wood? Like, you know, it's sometimes just like those kinds of questions that are like, call me into like yeah, what? And how do we explain this and dig into this in a way that's interesting to people? And so it threw me on a whole train of the history of like capitalism and lumber in this country, and why we build with wood, and what's inhibiting us from building with adobe or cob or all these other materials that are accessible and free and there for us. And so maybe it's just me because I'm interested in it, but it's those types of like everyday kind of questions and absurdities that really grab my attention.
I would say maybe just debunking misinformation for yourself. I remember I was reading years ago about the wind turbines, right? And the narrative recently has been, oh, the turbines are killing whales, which is not true. And then a few years ago, it was wind turbines are killing all the birds. It's killing all the birds. And you're like, oh my God, that's terrible. Like, we need climate solutions, but it's killing all the birds. Wind turbines, land-based wind turbines do kill birds, about 230,000 a year, but building collisions kill about 6 million birds a year. And cats kill about 2.5 billion, birds per year.
Rough
So
go
it's
for the
just
birds.
like, yeah, if you just hear that figure, you're like, oh, that sounds awful. But then you're like, okay, cats are out there, like, you know, really cramping the bird style. I think we're good with the wind turbine. So even things like that, it's like, okay, you know, I don't have to worry so much. So really digging in and trying to debunk those narratives, I think, can make you feel a little better.
I feel you on the comedy stuff. I mean, again, I go back to Don't Look Up. I mean, we made a movie that was an allegory or metaphor for climate. A lot of people thought it was funny. We also blew up the world at the end. So I think those two things can exist together. I do. We're going to open it up for questions. We got 10 minutes or so for questions. So if you want to raise your hand, I don't know if there's going to bring a mic over. Are we going to mic the questions? Yes. Okay, great. Go for it.
Hi. That's a bit loud. But I wanted to return to something that you mentioned in the beginning, Kate. You talked a little bit about how Taylor Swift's private jet debacle got her in a little bit of hot water. And I just wanted to ask, this is part of my preamble here, but I wanted to ask the entire audience if anybody knows who Mike Wirth is. Raise your hand if you can tell me who Mike Wirth is. Okay, nobody here knows who that is. He's the CEO of Chevron. I say this because as people who cover, climate and things like this, we've kind of forgotten Aristotle's poetics in a way. We don't tell climate stories like we tell other stories. We don't do a character and a conflict. And I think one way we can break through, and this is kind of shown in your work about Taylor Swift, is kind of naming and shaming the polluters and the people who are ruining our planet. And the fact that nobody here knows who Mike Wirth is kind of shows like, wait, we don't really know who these people are. And I think that leads into people feeling like, well, this problem's so big and there's all these statistics being thrown at me and I don't know what I can do. But in the end, it's people. There are people who sit at the top of these corporations and boards that are making these decisions, and people are malleable. They can be moved, they can be named, they can be shamed. And I think it's important in climate journalism to, introduce that aspect. And I was wondering what you thought about that as well, naming and shaming per se.
I'll take a crack at it. I mean, I run the Lever. It's an accountability journalism organization. The mission of the organization is to hold people accountable. So I totally believe in naming names of the decision makers who are making decisions that are bringing us to the end of the movie Don't Look Up. So, an end of the livable ecosystem. I also think that we focus a lot on governmental decision makers, because I think there's an argument to say that this is not in any way to absolve corporate leaders, but that corporations exist to be as rapacious and greedy as they can get away with to make as much money as they can make. That's sort of, that's the way our system, our society really is structured, for better and in many cases for worse. The government is supposed to be the entity to prevent that behavior from running roughshod over the rest of society. That's what their specific job is. So we tend to focus a lot on the lawmakers and the policies that are enabling that behavior, that are not confining or ending that behavior that is threatening the livability of the planet. So I guess it's not to say don't focus on corporate leaders and only focus on the government. It's both. But I remain, speaking for myself, I remain obsessed with the people who we have put in power to confine that behavior, who are instead enabling it, because they have the most power to actually stop that greed and that ecocidal behavior from running roughshod over everything else.
I think I'd add something too. I think it's always like a both and answer, but I find holding the powerful accountable one step of illuminating some of the systems at work that are getting us in this place. But that doesn't, it leaves people, that can also immobilize people, because it's like, okay, we're blaming these people for doing this thing. Okay, what are we going to do about it now? What am I going to do today about the fact that my house burned down in LA? Right? I was seeing a lot of that happen after the LA fire. It was just a blame game, basically. It was who can we blame for this happening? And there was a lot of coverage that was just trying to point in different directions with that. And it left many of my friends feeling just as helpless. And so I'm always wondering, what actually is the information that serves people to make action in their lives? It's one of the reasons I got trained in wildland firefighting where I live, because I was I'm gonna know, I need to know personally how to protect my home and my friends and family's homes. And I need to understand how fire moves through this landscape. And in doing that, now I have so much more information to be able to get involved in local politics. I wish that there were pieces that dug into that more, the everyday steps.
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, to maybe sort of bridge the gap between those two things. A lot of what I do is writing about people like Mike Wirth and Darren Woods and the CEOs of these fossil fuel and petrochemical companies. But thinking about the LA fires, I saw the thing that happens sort of when there are climate disasters. People say we should name these storms or these fires after the CEOs of these companies, which I think is totally right. For people who are going to be unable to rebuild their homes in Altadena or other parts of LA County, I don't know if if Darren Woods or Mike Wirth are the enemy in that case. It might be the CEO of the insurance company that pulled out of California, even though it was a profitable market for them, right? It's I think there's a question of when to target, when and who to target to channel people's anger in the right direction. And I'm not an organizer. I do not run campaigns, but I think there is a sort of interesting thread there to pull in terms of where is people's anger actually, and what will sort of make them feel like they can, get involved in something. And that's less of a journalistic question than it is an organizing question, I think.
Let me take very quickly one more. Yes, go ahead.
Hi. So my question, you all mentioned that there are not that many climate journalists. And so the first part of my question is, how can the public support climate journalists so that they don't burn out? Because I know that this work is very difficult. I personally support Heated newsletter by Emily Atkins, and she writes a lot about burning out and has had to take breaks as an independent news journalist. So curious there, what can we do to help support you all? And then because this is for creators, what recommendations or advice would you have for creators so that they don't burn out in this work talking about climate change? Thanks.
I mean, I have so many thoughts about burnout being in independent journalism. I guess I'll start because real quick. I think covering climate, being in journalism is a burnout job. Covering climate is like a burnout on top of burnout, because you want to change things and you can see the crisis. And the crisis in many cases doesn't feel like it's changing. But I guess the one tip I would have for people who are doing this kind of work, it's to try, it might sound trite, it's to try to take sort of the long view. I think we live in an instant gratification culture, right? Where social media is how much dopamine can I get in the next 30 seconds off of posting something and seeing what happens. That climate journalism is in some ways the ultimate long game of trying to chronicle what's going on, we're still dealing in the denial phase, right? As opposed to the acceptance and what do we do phase. So combating that, we haven't won even the denial part. So I think it's just about trying to lengthen the horizon of your vision in your work, which is not to say don't cover the day-to-day, it's to say I'm covering the day-to-day, knowing that all of the days together are going to be the impact I have, not really necessarily one day. Now, you gotta be in kind of a Zen state, and I'm typically not in that Zen state.
I would say it's kind of two things. One is that climate is not just bad things, it's also good things.
Yeah. It's
communities banding together, it's, a bunch of stuff. And then this is gonna sound trite, but I think it's real, is you need to touch grass. Oh God, I can't remember his name. He's a racist. He did, he did the Monkey Wrench Gang. Edward Abbey has his quote about being a half-hearted activist to make sure that if you want to fight for the land, you need to love the land, and that means going out into the land. And I think that's true. And by the land, I define that as you go to the beach or go hiking. I'm being prescriptive, I'm being descriptive here, but I do think it's really important to go outside.
It's such a kind question, too. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think sharing with journalists that you appreciate their work goes a long way, directly. It's a lot of my day at Covering Climate Now is letting journalists know that they're appreciated and there's something that they've done that has impacted someone else in an organization, another journalist or person. And then also there's a few funds, I'm not remembering them right now off the top of my head, that supply mental health and psychological support to journalists. And if you have extra funds, donating to those is really helpful as well. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. I would just say, arming people with education and knowing that we live in this new climate normal so they can best prepare themselves and their families, I think is a good takeaway. In examples as extreme as, LA wildfires, but something as simple as the lengthening allergy season. So, if you have a kid that has allergies or you do, you can have medicine on hand, or, you can best prepare yourself to kind of navigate these situations that climate change is intensifying and enhancing in our everyday lives. And a big way of helping people be prepared for that is to educate them.
Yeah, just quickly, I think it's hard to disentangle what is burnout inducing about climate journalism specifically from journalism, this failing industry we happen to be in, that, very hard to get publications funded, very hard to get any sort of long-form interesting journalism funded, and so on and so forth. And also, I have a wonderful psychoanalyst who has helped me a lot for things climate-related and otherwise. And I think giving people the means to access that, because therapy is expensive and almost never covered by insurance and inaccessible for so many people, is great. And I think everyone, should maybe give it a shot at therapy.
I want to thank everyone for joining us. I want to thank the sponsors of this panel, and I want to encourage everybody who's here to echo this, support climate journalism, and also think creatively, if you're a creator, about how to put climate into the stories you're telling. Doesn't always have to be in the foreground. It should always, as much as possible, at least be in the background, because it's in the background of all of our lives. Thanks again.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Lever Time. This episode was produced by me, Arjun Singh, with editing support from Joel Warner and Lucy Dean Stockton. Our theme music was composed by Nick Campbell. We'll be back next week with another episode of Lever Time.